Story number 1. The 13th Locker. The lockers in East Hollow High's West Wing were ancient, metal doors warped with age, their locks rusty and prone to jamming. No one wanted to use them, but the school was overcrowded, and students didn't have a choice, except for Locker 13. It stood apart at the end of the row, its surface scratched and dented, its number barely visible. No one used it. Teachers and students alike claimed it didn't work, but the real reason no one touched it was the stories. They said Locker 13 was cursed. Samantha didn't believe in curses. When she was assigned Locker 13 after hers broke, she just rolled her eyes and grabbed her books. "It's just a locker," she told her friends. But when she opened it, she felt strange. The air inside was cold, almost icy, and it smelled faintly of damp earth. She brushed it off and started loading her books in, ignoring the uneasy feeling in her stomach. That night, she had the first dream. She was walking through the school, but it wasn't right. The hallways were darker, the walls streaked with soot. Locker 13 was open at the end of the hall, its door creaking on rusty hinges. A soft whisper echoed around her, words she couldn't make out. As she stepped closer, something cold brushed her arm. She spun around, but no one was there. When she turned back to the locker, a pale hand was reaching out from inside. Samantha woke up gasping, her heart pounding. The next day, she tried to shake it off. It was just a dream, she told herself. But when she opened her locker, she froze. Her books were wet, as though someone had spilled water on them. She ran her fingers along the metal interior. It was dry. "Samantha, are you okay?" her friend Clara asked, appearing beside her. "Yeah, it's nothing," Samantha lied. But as she closed the locker, she saw something etched into the door, words that hadn't been there before. "Let me out." Samantha couldn't concentrate all day. Her teachers' voices blurred into the background as she thought about the locker. Had someone pranked her? Maybe one of the janitors had seen the message and cleaned it before anyone else noticed. By the time the final bell rang, she'd almost convinced herself it was nothing. But as she walked back to her locker, she saw it. The door was slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd locked it that morning. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped closer. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. Hands trembling, Samantha unfolded it. The writing was jagged, like it had been scrawled in a hurry. "They locked me in. They forgot me. Don't forget me." "What the hell?" she whispered. She stuffed the note into her pocket and slammed the locker shut. That night, the dream returned. This time, the hand reached further out of the locker, its bony fingers clawing at the edge. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could understand. "Please, help me." Samantha woke up drenched in sweat. She decided to investigate. The next day, during lunch, she snuck into the library and searched through old school records. Most of it was boring: test scores, sports awards, and photos of past classes. But then she found a newspaper clipping from 1974. The headline read, "Student found dead in West Wing locker." Her blood ran cold as she read the article. A boy named Daniel Reeves had been locked in a locker as part of a cruel prank. He'd suffocated overnight when no one heard his cries for help. The locker was 13. Samantha knew she should leave it alone. But that afternoon, as she stood in front of the cursed locker, she felt a strange pull. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." The locker door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was colder than ever, and something shiny caught her eye. A small rusted locket lying in the corner. She picked it up, her fingers numb from the chill. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in her ears. "Don't forget me." That night, she dreamed again. This time, she wasn't alone. Daniel stood before her, his face pale and hollow, his eyes dark and filled with sorrow. "You found my locket," he said, his voice barely audible. "They took it from me." "What do you want?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. "To be remembered," he said. "To rest." The next day, Samantha brought the locket to the school courtyard. She dug a small hole beneath the oak tree where the students often gathered, placing the locket inside. "I won't forget you," she whispered, covering it with soil. The air felt lighter, warmer. When she returned to her locker, the scratches on the door were gone. The whispers had stopped. Samantha sighed with relief, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Weeks later, a new student was assigned Locker 13. As they opened the door, a faint chill wafted out, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. And at the very back of the locker, almost invisible, was a new message scratched into the metal. "You forgot me." Story number 2. The Midnight Bell Hollow Creek High had a curious tradition. Every night, exactly at midnight, the school's bell tower rang 12 times. The bell hadn't been used for decades, not since the old clockwork mechanism was decommissioned. Teachers claimed it was just the wind rattling the machinery, but students knew better. They whispered that the midnight bell was a warning. It was said to have started after a group of students went missing 50 years ago. No bodies were ever found, but those who heard the bell claimed to see strange figures lurking in the halls late at night. Sophia didn't believe in the stories until she heard the bell herself. She had stayed late after the school play rehearsal to clean up the props room. By the time she finished, the building was empty, its long hallways eerily quiet. As she walked toward the exit, her phone buzzed. 11:59 p.m. "Crap," she muttered. She'd forgotten about the midnight bell. Her classmates always warned her, "Don't be in the school when it rings." Sophia shook her head. It was just a stupid superstition, but as the clock struck midnight, the bell rang. The sound was deafening, echoing through the halls like a funeral toll. Sophia froze, her heart pounding. The bell rang a second time, then a third. Something shifted in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. By the sixth ring, Sophia heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the end of the hall behind her. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer. By the 12th ring, the lights went out completely. Sophia fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty lockers and dusty bulletin boards. "Hello," she called again, her voice echoing. This time, she got a response, a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The flashlight flickered as she turned toward the sound. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move, breaking into a sprint. The halls seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting in ways they shouldn't. No matter how far she ran, the exit was nowhere in sight. Sophia's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, hoping for a call or a text. Instead, the screen displayed a single word: "Run." She screamed and dropped the phone. Behind her, the footsteps quickened, echoing with an unnatural rhythm. Sophia rounded a corner and threw open a classroom door, slamming it shut behind her. She pressed her back against the door, her chest heaving, as the footsteps stopped outside. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, then louder and louder. Sophia grabbed a chair, wedging it under the doorknob. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. The windows were barred, something she'd never noticed before. The knocking stopped. Silence. Sophia pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the other side. "Why did you stay?" She stumbled back, her heart racing. The door creaked open, slowly pushing against the chair she'd wedged under the knob. Through the gap, she saw an eye, black and reflective, like polished obsidian. Sophia grabbed a heavy textbook from a nearby desk and hurled it at the door. The impact made the door slam shut again, and the whispers turned into an angry hiss. She ran to the teacher's desk and yanked open the drawers, searching for anything useful. At the bottom of one drawer was a key with a tag that read, "Bell Tower." Without thinking, she grabbed the key and bolted out of the classroom. The hall was empty now, but the air felt thicker, heavier. She followed the signs to the bell tower, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. As she reached the staircase, she heard the whispers again. "Stop. Don't go up there." Sophia ignored them, climbing the spiral stairs 2 at a time. The higher she went, the colder it got, frost forming on the stone walls. Finally, she reached the top. The bell tower was ancient, its wooden beams cracked and splintered. In the center stood the massive bell, its surface tarnished and covered in strange markings. Sophia stepped closer, her breath visible in the freezing air. Her phone buzzed again. Even though she hadn't picked it up, the screen lit up in her pocket with another message. "It's watching you." Sophia turned slowly. In the shadows behind her, the figure emerged fully. It was humanoid but wrong, its face blank save for a wide, toothless mouth that stretched unnaturally. Sophia clutched the key tightly. "What do you want?" she whispered. The figure tilted its head, the mouth opening wider. The bell must toll. Realizing what it meant, Sophia scrambled toward the bell. She grabbed the rope attached to it and pulled with all her strength. The bell let out a deafening roar, shaking the entire tower. The figure screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail. Sophia kept pulling, the bell ringing again and again until the figure dissolved into the shadows. The whispers faded and the air grew still. The next morning, the janitor found Sophia at the base of the bell tower, unconscious but unharmed. When she woke, she tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. The midnight bell stopped ringing after that night, but sometimes in the dead of night, Sophia still hears it in her dreams. And she knows, whatever she banished isn't gone for good. It's waiting for her to return. Story number 3, The Substitute. The week Mr. Howard, the history teacher, disappeared was strange for the entire school. He hadn't shown up on Monday morning, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some students claimed he quit. Others said he was fired. A few whispered that something darker had happened. By Wednesday, the school announced a substitute teacher had been hired, Mrs. Vellum. When she entered the classroom, everyone fell silent. Mrs. Vellum was tall and impossibly thin. Her pale skin stretched taut over her bony face. Her eyes were a piercing gray, too large for her face, and her voice was soft but commanding, like the rustle of dead leaves. From the moment she stepped into the room, the air felt heavy. Sophia, sitting near the back of the classroom, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mrs. Vellum didn't bring any books or notes. She didn't even have a bag. She simply stood at the front of the class, her gaze sweeping across the students. "Let's begin," she said, her voice sending chills down Sophia's spine. Her lessons were strange. She didn't talk about wars or revolutions. Instead, she spoke about ancient rituals, forbidden texts, and civilizations that had been erased from history. No one dared interrupt her, but every time Sophia glanced at the clock, it seemed to move slower, the minute hand barely ticking forward. By the end of class, her skin was clammy and her head pounded. The next day, 2 students were missing. Liam and Kara, who always sat in the front row, weren't in their seats. Mrs. Vellum didn't acknowledge their absence. Instead, she continued her lesson, this time about doors that should never be opened. Sophia raised her hand. "Mrs. Vellum, what happened to Mr. Howard?" The substitute paused, her gray eyes locking onto Sophia's. "Some doors," Mrs. Vellum said, "are better left closed." The class erupted in nervous whispers, but Mrs. Vellum silenced them with a single glance. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with strange images. A door in the middle of a dark forest, carved with symbols she couldn't understand. Behind the door, something moved, its shadow massive and writhing. When she woke, her throat was dry, and her chest felt heavy, as if she hadn't been able to breathe. At school, another student was missing. This time, it was Clara, Sophia's best friend. Sophia confronted the principal during lunch, but he brushed off her concerns. "Students miss class all the time. Don't let your imagination run wild." But Sophia knew something was wrong. She stayed after school that day, determined to find out more about Mrs. Vellum. The substitute's name wasn't in the school records. In fact, there was no mention of her at all, no hiring paperwork, no background check. It was as if she didn't exist. Sophia decided to search Mr. Howard's classroom. She waited until the janitor left, then slipped inside. The room felt colder than it should. On the desk, she found Mr. Howard's lesson planner. The last entry was scrawled hastily, the ink smeared. "She's here. Don't trust her. Check the basement." Sophia's heart raced as she made her way to the basement. It was a part of the school no one ever used, filled with old desks, broken chairs, and forgotten textbooks. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. She found a door at the far end of the basement, its surface scratched and worn. Carved into the wood were symbols, just like the ones from her dream. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark except for a faint, pulsating glow at the center. As her eyes adjusted, she saw them. Liam, Kara, and Clara were standing in a circle, their faces blank, their eyes wide and unblinking. At the center of the circle stood Mrs. Vellum. She turned to Sophia, her gray eyes now glowing faintly. "I told you," Mrs. Vellum said softly. "Some doors should never be opened." "What are you doing to them?" Sophia demanded, her voice shaking. Mrs. Vellum smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "They are helping me prepare," she said. "This world, it's so fragile. It needs to be broken before it can be rebuilt." Sophia backed away, her mind racing. She needed to get help. But as she turned to run, the door slammed shut on its own. Mrs. Vellum raised a hand, and the glowing circle on the floor brightened. Sophia felt a pressure in her chest, as if invisible hands were gripping her lungs. She dropped to her knees, gasping for air. "You could join us," Mrs. Vellum said. "You've already seen the truth. Why fight it?" Summoning her remaining strength, Sophia reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She activated the flashlight, pointing it directly at the glowing circle. The light disrupted the glow, and for a moment, Mrs. Vellum recoiled, hissing like a wild animal. Sophia seized the opportunity, grabbing a chair and smashing it into the symbols on the floor. The glow flickered and then vanished. Liam, Kara, and Clara collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. Mrs. Vellum let out an ear-piercing scream as her form began to dissolve into smoke, her body twisting and writhing. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. "I'll find another way." And then she was gone. The next morning, Mr. Howard returned to school as if nothing had happened. He didn't remember why he'd disappeared, only that he'd needed some time off. The students who had gone missing couldn't recall anything after their last class with Mrs. Vellum. Sophia tried to explain what she had seen, but no one believed her. But every so often, in the quietest moments, she hears Mrs. Vellum's voice in the back of her mind. Some doors never stay closed,